My name is Ari Ciment. Withholding of care, Jewish approach is the talk. If you have the actual PowerPoint talk, when I say next, you just advance the next animation, and when I say next slide, you just go to the next slide. And the way to do that is just to press down or on the mouse button, next, and next slide. Here are the handouts that I plan on handing out. Handout number 1 and next. Handout number 2. If you have the lecture, you could print these out and follow along. Next slide. I would like to give a special thank you to Rabbi Avraham Steinberg. His excellent textbook, Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics, was used, and I looked up a lot of the references there. Also, edaf.com, hebrewbooks.org, halacha.com, Wikipedia, Rabbi Akiva Tatz, Dr. Daniel Eisenberg, Rabbi Dr. Howard Apfel, Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman, and local rabbeim here, Rabbi Yochanan Zweig, Rabbi Yaakov Gross, that I asked questions about this topic. Next slide. Just in terms of the highlights of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, I just want to point out that in 1904, next, the first American case of closed chest cardiac massage was performed. And it's just been since 1960, next, that CPR was developed. Next slide. And when we talk about do not resuscitate orders, it's a legal order written either in the hospital or on legal form to respect the wishes of a patient to undergo CPR or ACLS if the heart stopped or if they were to stop breathing. In other places, we call it allow natural death or do not attempt resuscitation, because the word do not resuscitate sort of implies that that you can definitely resuscitate if somebody's heart stops, and that's not the case, as we know. Next, 5% of patients who require ACLS outside the hospital survive. So it's 95% of people do not make it. So it should say do not attempt resuscitation. And documentation is tricky. Next slide. Living wills are different than do not resuscitate documents. Living wills attest next to somebody what they would want in a terminal condition. Next, and they say, I do not desire that CPR be administered in the event of cardiac respiratory arrest, but they really do not apply in a hospital setting. They could help guide families to what the patient desires, and you could fill out a DNR form, but they themselves are not do not have legal force in a hospital setting. Next slide. So there are some state forms that actually legalize withholding resuscitation from emergency medical services when they arrive to someone's outpatient setting. Next, there has to be a physician statement and a signature. Next, and again, a DNR/DNI applies when somebody has a cardiac or respiratory arrest. Next, so for instance, when Steve Jobs died of a respiratory arrest, that means that he stopped breathing. A respiratory arrest is cessation of breathing. If somebody arrives to the emergency room with a DNR form and has just respiratory insufficiency, is difficulty breathing, let's say from a pneumonia, technically, even if he has a DNR form, he can be intubated, and you will not be held responsible for intubating the patient. Of course, if the patient says that he doesn't want to be intubated, or the family speaking for him said that he would not want to be intubated, you wouldn't do such a thing in that case as well. Next slide. Just want to point out the CPR guidelines have changed in 2010. Next. Even though if there's somebody at DNR, there's no CPR or ACLS, the guidelines now state, instead of it being as simple as ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, now if somebody's unresponsive and you check a pulse and there's no pulse, you start with 30 compressions and 2 breaths. You start out with compressions. Next. And so it's CAB. CPR is not as easy as ABCs anymore, but it's as easy as CAB. Compressions, airway, breathing. The emergency room literature actually looks at the C as including compressions, cardioversion, capnography, cooling, and catheterization. But for our talk today, C is compressions, and that's what you have to know. Compressions are more important than the airway. And next, and this is in understanding also ACLS, advanced cardiac life support. That includes things like intubation, putting in central lines. Those things come after the initial resuscitation. Next. The reason why we do compressions first is basically because cardiocerebral resuscitation has better survival than cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation means that you do chest compressions followed by breathing, and cardiocerebral resuscitation is essentially doing compressions first and then airway second. And there's just a little bit better survival, 6% compared to 4%. That's why they do it that way. Next. It is important to note that DNR does not affect any treatment other than that which would require intubation or CPR. On the right-hand side, you see a famous algorithm for septic shock patients. And when a patient with a DNR is admitted to an ICU, I often get the question, should we be aggressive and do this algorithm? And the answer is yes. Unless they definitively do not want it, they are treated just as aggressively as any other patient. Next, and we possibly would continue chemotherapy, antibiotics, dialysis, blood pressors, and antiarrhythmics. Next slide. Okay, so on the slide, next and next, so you have the DNR circled there. On the withholding forms, DNR is disparate from other interventions such as next, x-ray, hydration, nutrition, antibiotics. A DNR only applies to resuscitation in case there's a cardiac or respiratory arrest, but other interventions, including antibiotics and nutrition, anticoagulants, and things like that, are up for discussion and usually continued unless otherwise specified. Next slide. Forms in most hospitals will have the patient or the patient family member, next of kin, or power of attorney attest to the fact that he or she is in a terminal condition, persistent vegetative state, or end-stage condition that would allow for a DNR to take effect. Next. These documents are always followed by one or two physicians concurring with that determination that the patient is in fact in a terminal condition, persistent vegetative state, end-stage condition. If there's a healthy 21-year-old and he fills out a DNR, that is it really is not applicable because he is not in one of those three conditions. Next. So withholding is not starting a therapy that isn't currently being given. In Jewish halacha, in Jewish law, this is where we are most lenient, sometimes allowed or even obliged. Next. Withholding chemotherapy or not operating on a high-risk patient is an example of withholding therapy. Next. Withdrawing, death is a direct effect. It's mostly forbidden. Next. Withdrawing a ventilator on a ventilator-dependent patient is an example. Next, withdrawing therapy administered intermittently is withdrawing during an interval between administrations, sort of intermediate between withholding and withdrawing. It's pretty controversial. Next, stopping intermittent dialysis or stopping antibiotic between doses is an example. Next slide. When you study American medical bioethics and you read the first textbook, many subsequent editions, but the first textbook written by Beauchamp and Childress, you can see that the four key principles are autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. But autonomy is really the principle that's given precedence. And next, you'll see statements such as this in the textbook. If a person desires death rather than life's more typical goods and projects, then causing that person's death at his autonomous request does not either harm or wrong the person. Clearly, once again, autonomy is given preference. Next slide. So let's consider the following ethical dilemma in the patient that we're considering withholding or withdrawing a ventilator on a suffering patient. There's an ethical dilemma. Next. On one hand, we have beneficence or quality of life issues, and certainly autonomy issues. Maybe the patient doesn't want it, or the patient's next of kin who is acting for him doesn't want him to be suffering. Next, on the other hand, we have the concept of non-maleficence, that we really shouldn't remove any life. There's some religious overtones in that ethical principle. But in American civilization, next, we tend, based upon what I just mentioned, we tend to favor autonomy. From a religious perspective, however, non-maleficence issues, meaning not removing any life, takes preference or precedence. And therein lies the true ethical dilemma that most patients and family members have most difficulty with, especially in this situation. Next slide. What makes this case even more interesting is that there's also a dilemma next in the concept of non-maleficence itself, because on one hand, the patient's having too much pain, and we don't want to prolong the pain and suffering, so there's a non-maleficence issue there. And then there's the other issue which we just discussed, non-maleficence in the sense of removing any life, euthanasia. Next, again, in American civilization, we tend to worry more, be more preoccupied with the concept of pain and suffering than we do for the value of intrinsic life itself. Next slide. Recently, the Annals of Internal Medicine, American College of Physicians came out with an ethics manual, 2012, January, and next came out with the following statement: withdrawing and withholding treatment are equivalent ethically and legally, although state evidentiary standards for and cultural and religious beliefs about withdrawing may vary. Clearly, American ethics will hold that withholding and withdrawing are equivalent, but from a Judeo-Christian point of view, this is not the case. So again, ethics and religion are apart on this. Next slide. It is important to point out that when we talk about American medical ethics, that's only one facet governing human social behavior. Next. There's also religion and, next, law that govern our behavior. Next. And when we take a look at the religions and their point of views in terms of withholding, withdrawing care, next, we'll see there's quite a variation. But today we're going to focus on Orthodox Judaism, of course. Withholding, yes. Withdrawing in general, no. Withdrawing artificial nutrition, no. And really going to focus on those three, maybe a little bit of euthanasia at the end also, which is generally no. Next slide. Let me first give you a nutshell before we go on. So in a nutshell, next. Oh, I'm sorry. In this nutshell, we still had the next slide. So in a nutshell, next, there are three categories, three things that would make you able to withhold therapy in a given patient. Number one, they have to have chayisha. Number two, they have to be either suffering uncontrollably or unconscious without hope of recurring consciousness. And number three, patient does not want treatment. Next, the caveat is you still can never actively hasten death. Only withholding may be okay. And you can only withhold things that are not fluids, nutrition, oxygen, basic stables. Next. So chayisha is either a consensus that a patient will not survive a year, 12 months. Israeli law is 6 months. Rav Yashiv says 3 months. And if it's doubtful whether it's chay olam or chayisha, we hold by the stringent view. Next, suffering uncontrollably is either physical or psychological. Irreversible coma, a patient had to clearly indicate wish. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that the comatose state may be suffering, so if it's in pain before, you assume pain during, but Rav Elyashiv holds actually that, and then patient doesn't want treatment. Next, that means that either there's no safe curative procedure, therapy exists but it's too risky or painful, fully informed and mentally competent adult, and not refusing therapy due to untreated pain or depression. So if there is a safe curative procedure, that wouldn't really count. Next slide. So in general, we think of there being two schools of thought in this controversy of withholding care. On one hand, we have people that are considered machmir in the sense that you can never withhold care. Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, Rabbi J.D. Bleich, and Rabbi Yashiv, Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Bleich, and Elyashiv would hold that no matter what, you essentially can never withhold care from a patient who is dying and perhaps suffering. Next, however, the less machmir or liberal group, hence the blue color, would actually hold that you could withhold care under certain circumstances, especially if a patient is suffering. And I just want to point out that we tend to think of machmir and less machmir in terms of life and death. So yes, it is true that Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Wallenberger, that Tzitz Eliezer would be machmir in the sense that no matter what, we have to prolong life. But if you look at it from the vantage point of suffering, next, then in fact, perhaps the Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Yashiv and Rabbi Bleich are actually more makil in the sense that they allow for greater suffering of the patient, whereas the other rabbis do not hold by any suffering, so we're allowed to hasten death. I mean, you can look at it at that vantage point, and remember we had the same type of idea when we talked about brain death, looking at two different shitas, whether brain death is death versus brain death is not death, and also looking at the people that are machmir may actually be makil in that sense, the similar type of argument. Anyway, next slide. The goal of today's talk is really to give you historical perspective on this topic. And as we know, halacha constitutes the practical application of the mitzvahs in the Torah, is developed through discussion and debate in the Mishnah and the Gemara, and codified in the Mishnah Torah or Shulchan Aruch. Mishnah Torah is written by the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Karo. And next, we're going to take a look at biblical stories. Next, we're going to analyze certain Mishnayos or Talmudic statements. And so we're going to be talking about roughly the time 250 BCE to 500 CE next. And then we're going to look at statements from Rishonim throughout the talk, from 1000 to 1400 next. And then, of course, the Achronim that came after them, 1400 to 1800, some of their inputs on this subject, including the Mechaber, the Rav Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch and codified part of the halacha next. And then we're going to look at the modern day poskim, such as Rav Moshe Feinstein there, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Elyashiv. And the goal of today's talk is, instead of just telling you what each different shita or opinion is on this topic, I wanted to give you a background and understanding the milieu from which they made that decision or decisions. Next slide. I want to recreate the milieu of which the halachas came up with their decisions in terms of the withdrawing debate. And to do this, I'm going to show a lot of the stories that are mentioned in Tanakh and in other halachic literature. So we'll start doing stories, much like Shel Silverstein. I'm going to start telling stories next. So let's start with this invitation and move on from here. Next. When considering the first instance of resuscitation in the Bible, people often quote the story of Elijah and the child. Next, the prophet was staying by a widow's house when her child seemed to die, and he stretched himself upon the child 3 times, apparently held by the most recent CPR guidelines, and he perhaps did some chest compressions, and the child regained life. Next, the question is, did he resurrect the child or did he resuscitate him? Resuscitation is really when you restore the consciousness or vigor of life, as opposed to resurrection, which is really bringing back from the dead. Next, I would like to point out that the Tosfos, when discussing this case, asked the question, how is it possible that Elijah restored life to this child? After all, he was a Kohen and he shouldn't be in the room of a dead person. The implication is that he actually resurrected the child, as opposed to what we probably normally do during CPR, which is resuscitation. Next slide. The next episode most often quoted in Tanakh regarding resuscitation is Elijah's student, Elisha, and he had a similar story next, where he was staying by a Shunammite's house and her son died, and it says that Vayal Vayishkav ala Yelod Vayasem Piv al Piv, he did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, apparently held by the previous guidelines, and he did airway breathing and then circulation. In any event, the child was brought back to life. Next slide. Technically, the very first case of resuscitation actually happened back in Egypt, although this is not literal like the Elijah story and Elisha story. This is based on a medrash. It says that the midwives in Egypt, when the children were sent off to die in the Nile and were dying, they took hollow reeds and blew air into the lungs of the children and restored their lives. And this is why one of the midwives' names was Shifra, which means Shifoferet, which is hollow. The hollow reed, representing the hollow reed that they used to blow air into the children. So we see technically the first resuscitation happening all the way back in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, when the children were sent off to die. Next slide. Another case of resuscitation, this time again mentioned in the Medrash, not a literal story like the Elijah and Elisha story. This is brought down by the Yalkut Shimoni, which is probably written around the 1200s. It's a compilation of some midrashim or folklore. And it says here, when the Jewish spies went initially into Israel, they were dumbfounded and astonished and actually had a form of respiratory arrest. And it says the ancient Canaanite people there saw them down, and it says they quickly did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and blew air into their lungs so that they could, as the Zayit Ra'anan says below, so that they could kedei lahachayotan, so that they can live again. So we actually see this. Technically, if you want to be precise, the first two episodes of resuscitation happened in ancient Egypt and in ancient Israel prior to the story of Elijah and Elisha. Next slide. So is there biblical precedent that suffering is worse than death? Next. First of all, suffering is not only physical but also emotional. Next. There are two Gemaras, Sanhedrin Mem Gimel and Mem Hey, which talk about a murder where you're supposed to imbibe a murderer with drink so that he is, as Rashi says, titaref da'ato v'lo yidag v'yisma'amea ber yigaso, that he shouldn't worry about his death. He should be numb to it because he's drunk. We're worried about his emotional wherewithal, as well as it says v'havta l'reicha kamocha, you should love your neighbor, bar lo misa yafe, you should pick an easy death for him, meaning a psychologically easy death for him. Next, but perhaps a more evident example would be in Shabbos 50b. That's Nun Amud Beis. It says that Megar Adam Gildei Tzoa v'Gildei Makesh al B'sara b'shvil tza'aro. It says that you're allowed to rub off the scabs on your body on Shabbos b'shvil tza'aro. And the Tosfos over there explains next. V'im ein lo tzar acher elishim spayesh leilech bein b'nei adam shari de'ein lecha tzar gadol mizeh. He says that the pain, if there's pain just because you're embarrassed to walk around with scabs, there's no greater tzar than that. So emotional suffering is also considered suffering by our gedolim. Next slide. So let's look at some of the preconceived notions. We'll go one by one, and hopefully we'll answer or attack some of these notions. Number one, Jewish guilt includes belief, next, that we are supposed to suffer, and it's even better than dying. Next slide. So I figured we could go in some sort of chronological order, and let's look at the biblical sources regarding hastening death or praying for death. Next slide. The very first source is in Perek Yud Aleph of Bamidbar, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Alone I cannot carry this entire nation, for it's too heavy for me. V'im kacha utzoseli, if Hashem, if you're going to do this to me, hargeni naharogi matzasi chen beinecha v'al ereh b'ra'ati." He says to Hashem, "Please kill me if I found favor in your eyes, so that I not see my evil." And the Ramban, who lived in the 1200s, early 1200s, he explains, Tov mosi afilu b'cherev adam mechayai b'tzar hazeh. It's better that I should die on the sword of man than live such a life of suffering. Next, Prophet Eliyahu in Malachim Aleph Perak Yatet says the following: that he vayishal es nafsho lamus. He actually requested for his soul to die. He was in the wilderness and he was suffering, and as the Metzudas David says, the Radvaz, who lived in the early 1500s, says, Rav ata, which means it's too much for me to bear. Ho'il vani ata b'tzar hazeh nechshavim li yamai lemerubim. Now, that is to say, since I'm now in pain, I consider my days too many. So we see Moshe Rabbeinu, we see Eliyahu the prophet next, and we see Yonah, famously in the end of Yonah in Parak Daled. It says, Vayihi kizruach hashemesh vayiman Elohim ruach kadim charishit vatach hashemesh al rosh Yonah, that there was a stifling east wind, the sun shone on his eyes. Oh. And again, the Metzudas David says below, Vayomer, it says, Al nafsho tov mosi mechayai v'zehu al kinach lamahod mitokef tmimus haruach v'nitzotzei hashemes v'saval yisirim harbe. He was suffering great sufferings, and therefore he said, it's better that I should die. So we see, again, prophets. These aren't just normal people. These are prophets. Moshe Rabbeinu, Eliyahu Hanavi, Yonah, these prophets actually praying to die. You know, we often say it's better to suffer than it is to die. And this is not seemingly the case if we see these prophets rather dying than suffering. Next slide. Shaul HaMelech in Shmuel Aleph chapter 31 fell on his sword rather than to succumb to his enemies for fear of enduring the suffering that entails surrendering to such terrible enemies. Next, it says, Therefore Saul took his sword and fell upon it. It is worth noting that he didn't stab himself per se. He actually fell upon the sword. It's sort of an indirect way of dying. Some controversially claim that this is a source of euthanasia in the Torah. Regardless, this is clearly an example of preferring death rather than enduring suffering. Next slide. Later on in Shmuel Beis, chapter 1, a young man, an Amaleki, recounts the story of Saul's death to David, King David. Next. And he states that Saul leaned upon his sword, Nishan al Chanito. Next. And the Ralbag explains that Saul didn't fully kill himself, and in order to complete the dying process, he leaned further on the sword. This seemingly perhaps would imply that you can hasten the death or dying process if one is suffering. Next, it's also interesting to note that David HaMelech ordered this lad's death, even though the Amaleki lad said that he killed Shaul only after Shaul asked him to finish him off to relieve his suffering. The possible implication there is perhaps David was paskening, as if to say that even if somebody is suffering, you don't have the right to finish them off or complete the dying process. So we see two different concepts within the same story and two implications perhaps. Next slide. Perhaps in response to those two implications, the Radak does explain next that Shaul had a specific heter, so to speak, to commit suicide because of the possibility that he was going to be desecrated by his captors. Next, also as to the implication that David HaMelech killed the Na'ar Amaleki perhaps because he hastened the death of Shaul, that is also neatly discounted by the Radak, who explains that actually David HaMelech killed the Na'ar because the Na'ar didn't really kill Shaul, but gloated over the death of a Jewish king and was making up the story, and therefore David HaMelech killed the lad. So in fact, you can't make any of those implications in this scenario, interestingly enough. Next slide. Perhaps King Solomon weighs in on this issue of suffering and hastening death, As he says, there is a time to be born and a time to die. Eis laledes veis lamus. Next, and the Sefer Hasidim next explains, what does that mean? There's a time to die. He says when a person is a goses and his soul is about to depart, you shouldn't pray shetashuv nafsho, that his life should be returned. Ki eno yachol lechayot ki ma'at yamim. He's not going to live but a few days, and those days are going to be of suffering. Next slide. Story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in Daniel chapter 3 again highlights that death is actually preferable to suffering. How is this? Next. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah sort of pen names in the Daniel, and they are told by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, to bow down next to a graven image, which is not necessarily an idol, but some golden image of Nebuchadnezzar's. They refused and instead decided to jump in the fire rather than bow down to this graven image. And the story goes that they walked out of the fire alive next. When the Gemara discusses this scenario in Ksuvas Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, it says, Dilma Malkus Chamor, perhaps lashes are worse than death. And the Gemara reasons that if they had lashed Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they would certainly have worshipped the golden image. In other words, because the punishment was just death by jumping into the fire, they figured they could die rather than jump into the image. But if rather than to bow down to the image, but if the punishment was actually going to be lashes, they certainly would have bowed down to the image. So again, suffering is worse than death, according to the Gemara's explanation of the episode Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I just wanted to point out the Tosfos in Avodah Zarah in Daf Gimel that clearly shows that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were not instructed to bow down to an idol, because for that they certainly would have had to endure lashes. But this was just a golden image. This was just a Kiddush Hashem that they were willing to jump in the fire. And it really needs to be examined what the heter is in certain cases to risk your life for Kiddush Hashem. But that's a whole separate topic. Next slide. Perhaps the most often quoted story in Tanakh regarding the discussion of Chayesha, or terminal life, is the story of Gehazi and his sons, the 4 lepers who were caught in between the city of Shomron and an invading Aram army. Next, they were debating whether or not they should starve to death or enter into the besieged city and there again starve to death, or go into the invading army's camp and risk death right away, but have the possibility of obtaining a favorable countenance and actually having some food to live longer life. And the pasuk clearly says, "Ve'ata, now, lechu v'nipla el machane Aram, im yichayunu nichya v'im yimisunu v'masnu." It says, let us go to the Arameans. If they save us alive, we'll live. If they kill us, we'll die. Concept, once again, is that it's better to die right away than to have to suffer. Some of the Meforshim and the eventual halachas, such as Rav Moshe Feinstein, asked the question, should we really learn halachas from 4 evil people? These lepers were actually not righteous people. The answer given is, regardless, the story in Tanakh is trying to give us an understanding of human nature, and despite the subjects here, there apparently is purpose in illustrating this specific dilemma to us, to show us potentially a right course of action. Next slide. So we finished talking about the biblical sources regarding hastening death rather than suffering. Now let's look at some of the sources from the Mishnaic or Talmudic period. Here is a Mishnah regarding trephos, Elu trephos bebehema. This Gemara, Mishnah in Chulin, and next a Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Chet are very instrumental in helping define the key terms that we're going to discuss throughout this talk, and let's take a look at them next. The top three terms next, goses, chayesha, and treifa, are halachic terms. A goses is halachic in the sense that it is terminal in last stages of life, possibly up to 3 days. Chayesha is halachic. It's terminal. It can be 3 months, according to Rav Elyashiv, 6 months, the Israeli law, 12 months in general. Treifa is non-viable, defines terminal illness. That person is 100% likely to not survive. Next, the anush, yitzias neshama, notel amus, and shchiv meira are colloquial terms describing the end of life. Next slide. As the following clip demonstrates, getting bogged down with statistical probabilities can be confusing because they could be interpreted differently depending on the situation. But in general, a chayesha and a goses are terms that have medical consensus opinions attached to them. Showing the subjectivity of statistical probabilities, here we have a nerdy type of guy asking this beautiful lady what are the chances he is going to end up being married to her. And so let's listen in.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah! I read you.
Another preconceived notion is that there is no relative value of terminal life as it is as valuable as long life, because both are of infinite value. Is there perhaps a relative value of life when you compare terminal life to longer life? So let's look at this question from the lens of the Talmud. Next slide. So let's turn our eyes to the first Gemara in Avodah Zarah Chaf Zayin Amud Beis 27b. It talks about a witch doctor next. If somebody's on the throes of death, meaning that he is going to die, most definitely in the next few days, he's allowed to see a witch doctor, as Rashi succinctly points out, which means what he's supposed to do. If he doesn't do anything, he's definitely going to die. So maybe the witch doctor will heal him. The Gemara then asks, but doesn't he have a little time to live, meaning that little time is going to be sacrificed if the witch doctor kills him right away? He could have lived an extra day or two. And the answer of the Gemara is, which means the life of the hour is not to be considered. The Gemara is trying to say here, seemingly, that the relative value of longer life is more advantageous than the life of a day or two, or of terminal life. So there is relative value of terminal life when looking at it in relation to longer life. The Gemara in Bava Metzia Kuf Yud Bey is 112a. It's very interesting, and some use this as the source of autonomy in Judaism. But it discusses a person who is hanging from a tree and picking fruits. What is the heter or allowance for such an action? Next, the pasuk says, "Biyomo titein scharo v'lo tavo alav hashemesh ki anihu." On the day of somebody works for you, you have to pay him because he's poor. Ve'elav hu nosei et nafsho, and he carries, and to himself he carries his own soul. And the Gemara explains what that means next. It says, "Ve'elav hu nosei et nafsho mipnei ma ala ze bekevesh v'nitla be'ilan u'masar esatzmo lemisa lo al scharo davar acher." It says, for what reason does a man ascend the ladder and hang on a tree and almost sacrifice his life? Is it not so that he could get paid his wages? The presumption is that he's giving up an ani is living in a chayesha existence. He's living in a situation where if he doesn't eat his next meal, he might not survive. So he's in a chayesha, but he's allowed to give up the remaining days or minutes of his life, sacrificing his life so that he could obtain a more longer lasting life. So again, we see the relative value of life in a chayesha existence, potentially hastening death in order to be able to have a longer life, again, in this Gemara. Next slide. Another fascinating Gemara is about a flask of water in a desert, as you can see here in Bava Metzia Samach Beis 62a. Next, the story goes that two people are traveling on a journey and one has a pitcher of water. If they both drink, they will both die. But if only one drinks, then he can actually reach civilization. So it's a machlokes between Ben Petura and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Petura says it's better that both of them should drink and they'll both end up dying because they'll both have a chayesha existence and not chaye olam, but at least two people will have that existence. But Rabbi Akiva came along and it said, based on the pasuk v'chayechecha imach, chayecha komim l'chayecha vercha. Truth be told, there's a lot of ways you could really analyze this Gemara, but some would say, Rabbi Akiva is trying to say that one person should drink the whole flask and therefore have chaye olam, and the other person will not make it. And perhaps that demonstrates, once again, that chaye olam, or more lasting life, outweighs the potential of chayesha. Because if not, then you would have imagined that two people with chayesha would be better than one person with chaye olam and one person who's dying. So temporary life relative to longer life it does have relative value. Once again, next slide. The fourth Gemara to make this point is about Ula and Bnei Chuzai. Ula was traveling with two non-Jewish escorts from Bavel to Israel, and this is recounted in Nedarim Chaf Beis 22a, where Ula is traveling, and all of a sudden one man next kills his friend, and Ula is frightened, and he tells Ula, "What do you think of what I did?" And Ula said, "I think you did great. Now finish him off." And there's, of course, a lot of discussion how it's possible that Ula did or said such a thing. Next slide. One reason espoused by the Meiri, a Rishon who lived in the late 1200s, was that actually the man was already dead and he was just trying to save himself. So he was able to say it next, even though the Tosfos in the Gemara another Gemara discussing this case says, how can it be that he reinforced the behavior of the sinner by saying, "Oh, you did well," but they explained that in a makom sakana, in a dangerous situation for his own life, he was able to do it. But on this, the Tzitz Eliezer seems to come up with his approach. Next slide. Below in that circle area, the Tzitz Eliezer explains, based on a Tiferes Yisrael there, that this is a classic case of Chaye Shah, terminal life relative to longer life, in the sense that the man who was dying from the stab wound, he was dying. He was a Chaye Shah. Ula, on the other hand, had potential long life. He was able to entice that other man to kill the man who was dying to save his own life, because the other man had no chance anyway. So again, we see the concept of temporary life, a chayesha, when relative to longer life. And I want to point out, in all these situations, 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we discussed, this is talking when you have chayesha in relation to chaye olam. Within chayesha itself, life is definitely, it seems, there is infinite value. It's when we talk about the possibility of having chaye olam that we start injecting relativism. Next slide. Next. The third preconceived notion is that you can never hasten death, even in the case of suffering. Next slide. And so now let's look at hastening death rather than suffering, Talmudic stories, going beyond the concept of chayesha and using that Ula and Bnei Chuzai as a starting point. Notice this is the same story that we talked about when we were talking about Chai Shah, because the Tzitz Eliezer and the Tiferes Yisrael explain the story of the Ula and Bnei Chuzai as teaching us that Ula sacrificed the life of a person who had terminal life for longer life, and that was the key concept of that story, according to the Tzitz Eliezer and the Tiferes Yisrael. However, next, the Ran, Rav Nisim, a late Rishon, explains this story differently. When Ula says, in, uparale beis hashchita, which means when he was telling the murderer, yes, you did well, and you should finish the job off, what he was trying to say was, sheyamus maher, that he should die faster. In other words, you should hasten the death so that he does not suffer. You should make it faster. So perhaps there's another way to look at this story of Ula b'nei Chuzai that is hastening death rather than suffering. Next slide. The next example is brought down from Gittin 57b, Nun Zayin Amud Beis. There the story goes that there were 400 boys and girls that were taken away for immoral purposes, and they somehow divined what they were going to be taken for next. And the Gemara describes how they decided to jump into the sea. If you look in the bottom over there, that's the Tosfos. It says, why is it that they jumped in the sea? Because hacha yereim hayu mi yisurin. They were worried about suffering, the suffering that they were going to endure. So therefore, they divined that it was okay for them to actively kill themselves. This is they jumped into the sea. They would rather hasten their own death rather than suffer. Next slide. Perhaps the most memorable Gemara regarding this topic is the Gemara about Reb Chananya ben Trajon, mentioned in Avodah Zarah Yud Chet. Ironically, the story about his tragic death is in page 18, which is 18 is Chai, his life. Next, the story goes that the Romans saw that Reb Chananya ben Trajon was teaching Torah publicly, and they wrapped him up in a Sefer Torah. They put tufts of wool on his chest so that he wouldn't expire quickly, as they lit him on fire with the Torah scroll. And the student said to Reb Chananya ben Trajon, why don't you open your mouth so that you could hasten your own death? And he said, Mutav shiyatlena mishenosna v'al yichavel hu ba'atzmo, which means better it is that he should take away who giveth, and a person shouldn't v'al yichavel hu ba'atzmo, he shouldn't do it himself. And then the executioner said, what if I remove the wool? Will you take me to the next world? And essentially he said, yes, I will. And he jumped in the fire along with Reb Chananya ben Trajon, and they both went to the Olam Haba, to the next world. But one of the key points here is that Reb Chananya ben Trajon wouldn't kill himself. However, he passively encouraged another to end the suffering. And this is used by many to show that you can't do anything active to hasten death, but if you do it passively, you could still hasten the death rather than suffer. A very key Gemara here. Next slide. Also would like to point out my alternative interpretation is going to be mentioned at the very end of this talk, so please pay attention. Next slide. You might be aware of the Sefer Ein Yaakov, which is a compilation of the Midrashim or folklore of the Gemara, the Talmud. There is also an Eun Yaakov, which is written by Yaakov ben Yosef sometime around 1492, and he asks the question, shouldn't have Rabbi Chananya ben Trajon died rather than suffer, especially in lieu of the story of the 400 boys and girls who jumped into the sea? And the answer that he gives there is that the midas chasidas hu, av shehayu alav yisurim kasha b'mashalo nisraf maher. And the point is that he was a chassid, he was an extraordinary pious person. And the suggestion is that if you can take the suffering and you want to endure the suffering, then it's okay. But you certainly do not have to suffer. So the 400 boys and girls jumped into the sea because they were scared of the suffering and they were entitled or allowed to do so. Rav Chananya ben Trajon, on the other hand, was of such pious nature that he did not want to die and rather endure the suffering. Next slide. The fourth preconceived notion is that you can certainly not remove an obstacle holding back death of a patient. Next slide. So is there a Talmudic precedent to remove an obstacle to death or passive withdrawal? Next slide. So the last case of Rav Hanania ben Trajon is actually a very good segue to this concept of Moser Hamonea, even though I used it in the section to elucidate the conflict between hastening death rather than suffering. It also is a story that illustrates the same concept of Moser Hamonea, passive withdrawal, in the sense that he allowed or sort of encouraged the executioner to take off the wet wool, which was holding back his inevitable death or dying process. And now we're going to take a look at other stories, similarly, like the city of Luz, the Medrash and Yalkut Shimoni, story of Rebbe's death, Rabbi Yochanan's death, and Choni HaMagel, and a Gemara about visiting the sick. So without further ado, let's do the next slide. So the first story is the city of Luz, a discussion in Sota Mem Vav Amud Beis, which is 46, part B. The story goes that in this special city of Luz, Malach HaMaves en lo reshus la'avor ba. The angel of death wasn't allowed there. El zakenim sheba bizman shedatan katzeh alehen yotzin chutz lechoma v'hen mesim. That when the elderly people would become tired of life, they went outside the wall and then die. Next, the Rav Moshe David Vilner, who died in 2007, said, Nira mikan shim ein adam yachol lispo od es hachayim muter lo listalik midavar shemarich yamav. He says, we learn from here that if a person is unable to endure life anymore, he's allowed to remove the thing that is extending his life. The way he explains it next is that this was an unusual predicament. Luz was a city with such a protective nature. It wasn't that they did an active euthanasia by going out of the city, but they were just bitlu et ha-segula ha-meyuchedet shel Luz. They nullified the extra special segula that was afforded to them by Luz, and it wasn't called an actual active type of death process. And he says further, v'have zeh kemeser hamonea es yitzias haneshama. It's like removing the thing that's holding back a normal death process. So there was something supernatural that was causing them not to die, and they just removed that supernatural part. But this would be a classic case of Meisir Hamonea, the city of Luz. Next slide. Parenthetically, we see this supernatural state that's holding back death by David HaMelech, and also similarly even by Rav Chisda. These Gemaras talk about how David HaMelech was learning all the time, and the angel of death wasn't able to kill him until he ascended a ladder, and it broke under him, and then he became silent from his studies, and then the Malach HaMavis was able to kill him. Similarly, Rav Chisda, he was never silent from repeating his Torah, and then he went and settled on a cedar tree, and the tree cracked, and Rav Chisda stopped, and the Malach HaMavis killed him. Very similar concept, that there was something supernatural holding back the death. Of course, David HaMelech and Rav Chisda are not going to be held accountable for stopping their learning, but they, in a sense, did passive withdrawal, leading to their death. Next slide. The next story is brought down in the Medrash. Yalkut Shimoni brings it down both by Akov and in Mishlei. I leave it in the Talmudic story section because it's about an old lady and Rav Yossi ben Chalafta. Rav Yossi ben Chalafta was a Tana who lived in the Mishnaic period, somewhere between 0 and 500. And the story goes next that the an old lady came up to Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta and said, I've grown very old, and my chayim shel nivelheim she'eni to'emes lo machav lo mashke ani mevakeshet lipater min olam. She asked to leave the world, and he said, how did you live this long? And she said, it's my habit every day that I go to the synagogue. So he said, don't go to the synagogue 3 days in a row. And she did that, and on the third day she got sick and she died. So he didn't actively do anything that caused her death right away, but he removed, so to speak, the segula, again, the supernatural element that was protecting her from death. Some would explain this as being, breaking the habit, whatever it is. It's removing something that was enabling her to live. So that's a Meisir Hamonea, removing the element that's withholding back her death. We see this concept here by this medrash, brought down in the Yalkut Shimoni in Akev and in Mishlei. Next slide. So that is a pane of glass, and that is a rabbi in pain. And this is supposed to signify the story of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, his dying process in Ksuvas Kuf Daled 104a. Next, the story goes that the Rebbe's handmaid ascended the roof, and she said, the immortals desire Rebbe, and the immortals desire Rebbe to join them, and the mortals desire Rebbe to remain with them. So she prayed, may it be thy will of Hashem that the mortals may overpower the immortals. When, however, she saw how often he resorted to the privy, painfully taking off his tefillin, she prayed, may it be thy will that the immortals may overpower the mortals. Yehi ratzon sheyechofu elyonim es hatachtonim velo haveshasku rabbanan milabai rachme. But the rabbis incessantly continued their prayers and made it impossible for Rebbe to die. So what she did is she threw a jar down from the roof to the ground, and for a moment they ceased praying, very similar to the stories I mentioned of the death of David HaMelech and Rav Chisda. But they ceased praying, and Rebbe departed to his eternal rest. He died. And here is another example of she didn't do anything active to remove Rebbe from dying while he was suffering, but she removed the supernatural segula, the supernatural element that was keeping him alive, which was the prayers of the other rabbi colleagues of his. And that is a classic case of Meisir Hamonea. Next slide. These next three cases are slightly different than the Meisir Hamonea, but also have inherently this passive withdrawal concept. Here we're going to be talking about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Here's Rocky and Apollo fighting. Rabbi Yochanan was the Rebbe of Reish Lakish, and they sort of had this relationship where they really admired each other, but they were constantly fighting, so much so that Rabbi Yochanan actually caused the death of his prized student, Reish Lakish. It's mentioned here in Bava Metzia, Pei Dalid, that is 84a. Next, what happened was, after Rabbi Yochanan lost Reish Lakish, he went out of his mind because he missed him so much, and he cried and cried. It says there at the last line, Have kavat tzavach ad shaf da'aseh minei. He cried until he lost his mind. It was turned Ba'u Rabbanan Rachamei Aleah V'nach Nafshe, and the rabbis prayed for him, and he died. The rabbis, of course, didn't do anything actively to kill Rabbi Yochanan, but they prayed for him, and sort of, in a way, Meisir Hamonea, they removed the protective element in the opposite way than the rabbis prayed for Rebbe's life. They prayed for Rabbi Yochanan's death, and in this case, Meisir Hamonea caused his death, Rabbi Yochanan's death. Next slide. A strikingly similar story happened to Choni Hamagal, Choni the circle drawer, in Tanis Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph 23a. By the way, he was called the circle drawer because he drew a circle in the dust. When on one year there was a drought, and he begged to Hashem, he said, I'm not moving until it starts to rain from this circle. In any event, this is the story next, where he fell asleep for 70 years. He woke up, and then he went to the base measures, to the study hall, and he was very upset because nobody would believe that it was him, Choni the circle drawer, Choni Hamagal. And that's where we say the concept O Chavrusa O Mitusa, that you have either a friend or death, because nobody would believe him. In any event, he prayed for his own death, and he died. It says Chalash Date Ba'i Rachame Umes, similar to the story of Rabbi Yochanan where the rabbis prayed for Rabbi Yochanan's death. Here, actually, he prays for his own death because he was so emotionally scarred. Again, we see the concept of Moser Hamonea. He didn't actively kill himself, but he was removing that which was withholding him from death, which is his personal piety, his righteousness, and his good health. He was praying to be for that to go on the wayside and so that he could die. Next slide. So I showed a case where, like the Rabbi Yochanan case, where the rabbis davened for a specific person to die because they saw that he was suffering emotionally. I showed a case where a person himself, Choni Amagel, was suffering and he prayed for his own death. Those are both cases of Moser Hamonea, or passive withdrawal. But here we see a Gemara which says next, Kol she'ein mevaker chola ein mevakesh alav rachamim lo sheyicha v'lo sheyamus, that a person who does not visit the sick doesn't get a chance to pray for mercy, not only that he should live, this person, but maybe if he's suffering that he should die. So this Gemara specifically is talking about visiting a sick person who looks like they're suffering, how there are times that you may actually pray for their death. Next, this is famously brought out in this Gemara here in Nedarim, Mem 40a, where the Ran next says, Ein mevakesh alav rachamim lo sheyechav lo yamus nira be'enai da'achi kamar pamim shetzarich levakesh rachamim ala chole sheyamus kegon shemitztar hachole bechalyo harbe v'efshar lo sheyechia. There are times that you have to daven for mercy that a person who is sick should die, such as when he's suffering. Here you see, now we're sort of leaning towards the halachic aspect of this talk, but it is another example of a Gemara that talks about how this concept of passive withdrawal, of course you're not actively doing something to kill this sick person, but you're, in a sense, removing that which is protecting him, whatever, spiritual protection, by praying for his death. Next slide. Now finally we're going to look at the Gemaras that show that every second counts. Next slide. The Gemara in Gittin Ayin Amud Aleph, and this is reiterated in Avodah Zarah Yud Beis, talks about a man who swallows a wasp and has little time to live. Next, it says that he's allowed to Nashke Reviyasa Dechala, we actually give him a revius of Shamgar's vinegar to keep him alive long enough to enable to give his last instructions. Efshar Dechayi Porto Mafkid Levese. I heard in the name of Rav Belsky from Rabbi Yaakov Gross that this is an example of quality of life issues, because it should just say that we give him vinegar to keep him alive. Why does it say Dechayi Porto the Mafkid Levese? So he gives his last instructions. Shows that he must have some quality to that extra life. But in any event, the literal translation is that we want him to live a little bit longer, and every second counts. Next slide. Next. Even if a sword is on your neck, we don't give up hope. We see this Gemara in Brachos Yud 10a talks about the discussion between Yeshayahu and Melech Chizkiyahu. Yeshayahu did not approve of Chizkiyahu's lifestyle. He did not want or have children, and he said he was going to be punished for it. And Chizkiyahu said, "Oh yeah, well, why don't you give me your daughter?" Yeshayahu said, "Too little, too late." And then he answers, Chizkiyahu answers, "Kach mekubalani beis avi ava." I learned in my grandfather's house, "Afilu cherev chada munachas al tzavaro shel adam al yimana atzma min harachamim." Even if there's a sharp sword on your neck, don't give up hope. Don't give up prayer. Next. In this discussion, Afilu cherev chada is also seen in Avodah Zarah in a Yerushalmi. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, there it's slightly different. It talks about how Moses was saved from when it says Vayatzileni mecherev paro, from the sword of Paro. Also, we see Afilu cherev chadam nesuna al tzavaro kadosh baruch hu matzilei hamenu. The point is that every second counts. Don't give up hope to the last minute. Next. A hypothetical case is brought up in Baba Kama Chavav Amud Beis 26b. There's a man who throws a baby off a roof, and there's a man wielding a sword below, and the guy spears the baby to second before it hits the floor. The question is, who is responsible for the death? It's a machlokes, Rabbanan, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. This is similar to the Gemara that we had in Sanhedrin Ayin Chet. Next. And the Rabbanan say the man who threw the baby off, because you need kol hanefesh, ein kan make kol hanefesh. It has to be somebody who is responsible really for the whole death of the person from beginning to end. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, Chayev zeh shekilu b'sayef mipnei shekira v'smisaso. He holds it's the person at the bottom who's spearing the baby right before it hits the ground, because technically the baby wasn't dead. And another way to understand this Gemara is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is holding out for the last second. Afilu, this is a good case of afilu cherev chada munachas al tzavaro. Even if a sharp sword is against somebody's neck, he's not dead. Here, the baby is falling down, but he's not quite dead until he hits the ground. So therefore, we hold out to the very last second. Another example of every second counts. Next slide. Probably a source for much halachic discussion regarding this matter is Yuma Pehei 85a. Talks about falling debris on the Sabbath. If there's a building and debris on a person on the Sabbath, are you allowed to desecrate the Sabbath to remove the debris and uncover this person? Next, well, the Gemara says, Lo mi baye ka'amar, lo mi baye safek usham, safek en usham. Well, if we're not sure that the person's there, definitely you could remove it for the concepts of pikuach nefesh, docha Shabbos. The question is, if you know that somebody's there, but you're not sure he's alive, even in that case, even if he's only going to live, even if he's not going to live for a long life, we're allowed to uncover the stones and remove him. And from here we see a chayesha, chayshinan, that we are makbid, or we are concerned about just a little bit of time of somebody's life. Again, every second counts. Next. In fact, this Gemara is also brought down in the Yerushalmi, and you really have to be fast when you encounter such a situation. Hazar is meshubach. It says somebody who acts fast to uncover the debris, that is praiseworthy. Hanishal maguna. If you're asked the question and implying that you're not doing anything active to remedy the situation, maguna, that's despicable. Vashoel harizeh shaver. And if you're the one asking the questions, that's like you're killing the person. You really have to act fast. Every second counts. Next slide. In the Mishnah, in the Meseches Ketanos, again, a Mishnaic period source, where it says Meseches Smachos, which is really the Mesechet talking about more Avelus, Hagoses Harihu Kachai L'chol Davar, a person who is on the throes of death within the 3 days of dying, he is considered alive. And it says there, Ein Mezizin Noto, you don't move him, Ein Ma'at Simin Es Einav, you don't close his eyes. Rabbi Meir Haya Moshel L'ner Shu Mitaftef. It's like a candle, Rabbi Meir said, that is flickering. When a person touches it, he extinguishes it. Anybody who closes the eyes of the goses, it's like he is killing him. Again, a goses is alive in all respects because every second of life counts. Next slide. Okay, so summary slide next. First, we talked about biblical sources regarding resuscitation, such as Eliyahu and the child next, and Elisha and the child next. We looked at Shaul HaMelech and biblical stories regarding hastening death. Next, we looked at the 4 lepers story, and that introduced the concept of Chaye Shah, or terminal life. Next, we looked at the Gemaras regarding the Talmud regarding these Chayesha issues, such as the witch doctor, or next, the man dangling down to pick fruits and vegetables. Next, if you're stranded in a desert and there's only one ketone of mayim, one jar of water. The Machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Ben Betura, Chayecha Kodmim, but temporary life relative to longer life. Next, Ulam B'nei Huzai, as it relates to this dilemma of temporary life relative to long life, but also as it relates to the hastening death issue. Next, 400 boys and girls jumping in the water, active euthanasia perhaps, or was it just to hasten death rather than suffer? Rabbi Hanani ben Trajan was next, where we talked he didn't kill himself, but passively encouraged to end suffering. Next, that led into the concept of Moser Hamonea, city of Luz. Next, the lady who stopped her habit of going to shul 3 days and died. Next, the story of Rebbe's death, how Rebbe's handmaid enabled him to die. Next, Rabbi Yochanan, who the rabbis prayed for his death. Next, we looked at Choni Hamagel, who prayed for his own death. And next, then we looked at every second counts. The Gemara is about the wasp. Next, about the concept afilu cherev chadam nachas al tzavarav al yimanam atzma min harachamim. Next, the case of the child that is not considered dead until the very last second, even after he's thrown off a roof. Next, and the case of debris falling, and the goses is considered alive in all respects. Next, and that leads us to now the halachic codification after that summary slide. Next slide. So let's look at the halachic codification in this topic, and we'll look in chronologic order. The Rambam in the 1100s, the Tur in the 1300s, Shulchan Aruch in the 1500s, and the Ramah in the later 1500s. Next slide. So let's first look at the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, where we talked about that Gemara. Shenafla alav mapolet safek hu sham, safek eno sham. He codifies it in halacha, even though the person is probably not alive, and actually efshar sheyavri, and impossible to survive. We still allow you to be mechal Shabbos, to desecrate the Sabbath in order to motziin oso l'chaye osasha, meaning we desecrate the Sabbath so that he could live, even though he's only going to live a short amount of time. Next. And this is the same thing I just said that is highlighted. Next slide. In Hilchos Rotzech, in the laws of murder, the Rambam states that if somebody kills a healthy person or a person who is about to die, much like a goses, that person is held responsible. So once again, we see the regard for a person who is going to die. He does differentiate between a goses bidei adam, which is a person who is imminently dead because of inflicted wounds, versus a goses bidei shamayim, which is a natural death. Much like next, we saw that in the Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Chet, which we touched upon in the very beginning. But again, we see the regard for somebody who is imminently dying, that it is considered very much alive, according to the Rambam. Next, this concept is taken later in the 1800s, by the way, by Rabbeinu Yosef in the Minchas Chinuch in 1800s. He says it probably a little more strongly. If somebody kills somebody who is about to die, even if somebody is about to die a natural death, it says din mishpat harotzeach. He is considered very much a murderer. Next slide. And the it's not over till it's over is a concept also next attributed to the Tur Shulchan Aruch in the late 1200s and the 1300s, and he clearly says, "Ein ma'amitzin einav ad shetetzei nafsho." You cannot, I think it means close the eyes of person who is about to die, and that is considered shofech damim. It's spilling blood. Again, you might be terminating the very last minute of somebody's life, and this is interesting. Next slide. Rav Yosef Karo codifies the halacha in the Shulchan Orech, number 3 there. Similarly, he actually quotes pretty much straight out of the Tur, Ein ma'amitzin einav ad shetetzei nafsho. Next, he also he brings down the story of the Hilchos Shabbos, and he clearly says, even if the person's only able to live for a short period of time, you're allowed to desecrate the Sabbath, much like the Rambam codified. we saw before. Next. So what about the key Ashkenazi halachic authority Rav Moshe Isserlis in the 1500s? He reiterates the point made by the Tur, next, but he brings something interesting. But at the same time, you're not allowed to do something that will enable the person to live longer, like cutting trees, in order that the soul does not depart. He says that's vaday aser. It's definitely not allowed. And not only that, you're mutter la'asiru, you're allowed to remove that which is holding back the imminent death, especially if there's suffering involved. And it sort of reiterates the Gemaras about Luz, about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rav Chanana ben Trajon. Next slide. And for this section, we're going to look at a modern panel and approach and some modern-day halachas. Rav Avram Steinberg, of course, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics is amazing. Rabbi Tatz has a book dedicated to these topics. Rabbi Lezer Yehuda Waldenberg is the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Bleich, Rabbi Yashiv, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Schachter, Zalman Chaim Goldberg, Chacham Avad Yehodaya, Rav Shmuel Wozner, and then I will discuss an RCA summary. Let's, without further ado, next slide. So you can withhold if you have all the following. 1, chayisha. 2, suffering uncontrollably or unconscious without hope of recovering consciousness. And 3, patient does not want treatment. You need all 3 of these to withhold treatment. Next, and the caveat is you can't ever actively hasten death. It's only withholding that's okay. And withholding does not include fluids, nutrition, oxygen, basic staples. We will see a somewhat das yachid holding otherwise. Next, chayisha. Next is a medical consensus that the patient will not survive a year, 12 months. There's no outright source for this. There is some connection to a treifa. Israeli law holds 6 months. Rav Yashiv says 3 months. And if it's doubtful whether it's chayisha or chay olam, we hold the stringent view. So we would say the person is going to live chay olam. Next. Suffering uncontrollably. Next, what does that mean? It's not only physical, it's also psychological. Irreversible coma. What do we do in that situation? Patient had to clearly indicate wish before. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach holds it may be suffering. If in pain before, you assume pain during coma. Rav Yashiv says coma is not suffering, and if so, there's pain before, and thus withholding resuscitation is a possibility. It should be reversed because the coma is a non-painful situation. And these things I heard from both Rabbi Avram Steinberg and by reading Rabbi Tatz's textbook. Next. Patient doesn't want treatment. Next, that means that he doesn't want to continue because there's no safe curative procedure or therapy exists, but risky or painful. Fully informed, he must be, and a mentally competent adult, and he must not be refusing therapy because of untreated pain or depression. Next slide. So the most machmir of the Ashitas is ascribed to the Tzitz Eliezer here, Rabbi Lezer Yehuda Waldenberg. Next. Basically, you can't withdraw or withhold anything that hastens death. Next. And basically, he says here, Kol Mekarev Misa La'adam Asher Od Neshama V'Apo, blah, blah, blah. Ein Beino Levein Rotzeach Ragil V'Lo Klum. There's no difference between this person and a murderer. So he holds that you can't hasten the death, even of somebody who is dying. Next. He is reasoning, as mentioned in other Sfarim of his. He says, Chayav la'asos ma'amatzim b'chol la'atzalos nefesh hagoses b'derech ha'refuah b'chol midei efshar v'lo gam chayisha bilvad ki yikarim ma'od rigei eno shala yedmus v'yesh kona olamo b'shal v'rega achad v'hurei tshuva. Every second counts, sort of reiterating the concepts that we saw in the last stories regarding the concept of every second counts. Yehuda Waldenberg is very machmir, not withholding even a second of life from somebody. Next slide. Something fascinating next that we see in the Tzitz Eliezer is even if the patient says, "Do not treat me," you would treat the patient because perhaps this bitter life is meritorious and treatment should be given. Next, I'll read it to you down here. He says, He's analyzing the Gemara that we talked about where the debris fell on a person on Shabbos and he's not going to live, and we still are mechal Shabbos for him. He says, even if the sick person is screaming, he says, leave me alone, don't touch me, give me any help because I'd rather die. He says, even this bitter life is precious. It's considered meritorious for this person to suffer. So you would prolong this life of suffering because there's a concept that perhaps it's a merit for the person. Next. Can't even pray for the death of such a patient, he even says. Next. And it says that Al kain lo nucha lahachlit shemuter lihispala lalav sheyamus davar shelo nizkar b'halacha lo b'Rambam lo b'Turah lo Shulchan Aruch. So even though we saw the Ran in that Gemara in Nedarim, how you could visit a sick because you might have to pray for their death if they're suffering, he says the fact that it's not brought down in halacha, not in the Rambam, and the Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch, shows you that we don't paskin like that, and therefore there is no heter, there is no permissibility to pray for the death of a patient who's suffering. Next slide. Another very interesting point that he makes next is that even though you can't pray for the death of such a patient, you can pray for the removal of Yisurin, for the removal of suffering. And he quotes a tefillah from the Pachad Yitzchak, from Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who says, this is a tefillah you could say for a goses who is suffering. Ana Hashem ekach rachamecha rabim of Rav Chasdach Hagdolim yiratzam lefanecha shetotzi mimaskir asir nefesh ploni o ploni svetotziehu mi Yisurin. He's saying, may it be God's will to remove this person from pain and suffering. Not necessarily remove the patient from life. Next slide. Rabbi Yashiv, of course, is a great gadol living in Israel. He does not have clearly written sources on this topic, but I have this from direct communication with Rav Avram Steinberg, who was in direct communication with Rabbi Yashiv on this. Next, basically, key points is that he does distinguish adults and children. Children, even with great suffering, are not made, do not resuscitate usually. Chai Isha, less than 12 months, but is not less than 12 months, but less than 3 months. And it must be real suffering, perhaps not coma or depression. We pointed out before that if somebody said they do not want to go through the suffering and they're in a Chai Isha situation, but then become comatose, Rav Yashiv would say, well, now he's not suffering anymore, so he wouldn't be up for the possibility of withholding care in that type of patient. Next slide. Rabbi J.D. Bleich is also considered a machmir on this topic. Next. Essentially, he holds that the quality of life issues really have no role when it comes to the Judaic approach to end-of-life matters. Here I'll quote from him directly here. In the event of a terminal malady, Judaism denies man the right to make judgments with regard to quality of life. In general, he holds that there's no withdrawing and no withholding. Next slide. Medications and respirations, and certainly food and nutrition cannot be withheld. And look at his quote below. Similarly, commonly drawn distinctions between ordinary versus extraordinary means of treatment and the exclusion of heroic measures in preserving life have no parallel in Jewish sources. One is hard-pressed to find appropriate terminology in Rabbinic Hebrew to express such distinctions. They have entered contemporary moral discourse through the mediation of an entirely foreign religious tradition. So, he holds that it's no different to say that we should not withhold food and nutrition than we should withhold medications and respirators. Next. He does say that a person with intractable pain theoretically can have his care withheld, but not actively withdrawn. But he does say it's theoretical because nowadays we should have all pain under control. The sentence here, he says, the few exceptions to the primacy of preservation of life must be spelled out with precision. One such exception does exist, at least in theory, in the case of a patient who suffers intractable pain. But he even says there, although active euthanasia cannot be countenanced in any circumstances, withdrawal of treatment is warranted in such situations. So absolutely no withdrawal, no withholding, but in somebody with intractable pain, which is theoretical, they could be withheld, according to Rabbi J.D. Bleich. Next slide. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is considered a less machmir on this. Next. In the Mincha Shlomo, B'davar nituach l'chol mesukan hatupil b'chol goses. The topic there. Next. So Rav Shlomo Zalman says, although you can pray for a patient to die, you still have to treat. Next, it says, even while you're praying for the patient to die, you're still obligated to work and try to save the person, and even desecrate the Sabbath if you have to, while you're praying for the patient to die. Next, he does, unlike J.D. Bleich, who does not differentiate between ordinary and extraordinary treatments, he does say that you cannot stop routine medications such as insulin or antibiotics or blood products. Next, clearly here he says, even when the patient is suffering greatly, the food, oxygen, you have to give that even against his will. Next. But you can abstain to proactively treat an incurable predicament if it's going just to add painful existence. Next. It's interesting, he points out, it's there's the concept of autonomy here. If the chola does not want these things, you could abstain from it. If the chola does want everything, and he wants to go on with his painful existence, of course, you can't deny him that opportunity. Next slide. So let's look at the Hashita of Rav Shechter. Next. Essentially, he's asked the question, if somebody is really sick and they don't want to endure a treatment and they'd rather die than live on in this predicament, are they over the Torah mitzvah of Vinishmartim, which is to guard their body and their soul? Next. And he essentially breaks it down to three categories. There's a situation that all people would want to go through the treatment phase and endure the process. That even though he feels that he doesn't want to go through it, you could actually force him to go through it in that case. And there's a second scenario would be if most people would not, the chol adam, that all people would definitely not want to go through this. Then we say bat ladato etzel dat kol bnei adam again, and it would be prohibited to force him to suffer through, even if he wanted to. And then he says the third case is the leika umdina demuchach l'shum echad min hatzaddim. It's not quite clear. There's no clear cut. All people would want it, or all people would not want it. In that case, davar talui b'das hachole. That's when patient autonomy comes into play. There is a concept of autonomy based on next and elav hu nosei nafsho. The pasuk that we saw before, brought down in the Gemara, to his soul he carries himself. And once again, the key points I mentioned here Next. So the concept of autonomy, patient autonomy, comes from Ve'elav Hunosei Nafsho, to himself, he carries his soul. He quotes the Gemara there in Bava Metzia that we looked at, Kuf Yud Beis 112a. For what reason do we allow somebody to go up on a tree and pick fruits and risk his life? Is it not for reward? And you could ask the same question there. Isn't he over the concept of nishmartim, that he should watch over his soul? And the answer that the Noda B'Yehuda gives over there is that a poor person needs to take risks, otherwise he's not going to survive. He doesn't have a choice. In this situation, we allow autonomy according to Rav Shechter because it's not clear cut which way to go, and we do see this concept of from here that a person can actually make a decision, and it's worthwhile. Next. You still cannot remove any tubes already in place. You can't do a maisa begufo. And when he brings down the thing we saw, the halachic opinion in the Yoredeya, and Lametet, where it says mutar lahasr davar hamonea, he says rak maisa begufo asr lasos. You can't do an obvious, clear action. And liot sheva al tase lechora lo matzi iser. You don't see anything wrong with sitting back and letting nature take a course. It's even better just not to do anything. Next slide. Rav Shachter asks an interesting quandary on his own shita, and he says, well, we know that you don't incur the death penalty. One does not incur the death penalty for confessing to a murder, but rather you need two witnesses. Why? As the Radbaz explains, perhaps ein nafsho shaladam kinyano ela kinyan hakadosh baruch hu. A person does not own his own nefesh, and it's a Hashem, and then therefore lo toil hodaso b'davar she'ena shalot. So the confession is null and void because it's not his soul to give up. He will not incur the death penalty by himself in that case. Next, so why is it any different here if a person does not want any further treatment? So he explains, when it comes to these life and death situations, a person in pikuach nefesh, in the realm of the halacha category of pikuach nefesh, we do see that a person does have nechshav kibalim. He does have a sense of entitlement of his soul, as opposed to in the case of the hilchos ritzicha. Next, he also brings down that you can withhold potentially even basic routine food, water, nutrition, and oxygen. This is where he differentiates himself and other key halachas. He says here, Sefer Nishmas Avram, he quotes the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that he hevi bishmo lahavdil bein tipulim shagartayim levein tipulim sheim mechutz legeder hashgar. He says he brings down that there's a difference between ordinary and extraordinary treatments. And in a sense here, he's like Rabbi J.D. Bleich. He doesn't see that there's a distinction. But unlike Rabbi J.D. Bleich, who says there's no distinction and you can't withhold any of them, Rav Shachter seems to be saying there's no distinction and you could withhold both of them. Kol advarim ha'ele tzarich in gadol, devadai ha'pashas u'k'divrei Stipler. But so that's the difference between Rav Shachter and Rav J.D. Bleich there in that situation. Next, I want to point out from the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics, he says all rabbis rule that it is forbidden to withdraw next or withhold food and fluids from a deathly ill patient in order to hasten his death. It seems to me that Rav Shachter would not agree with this prohibition, perhaps. Next slide. So let's look at what the key halachic figure in the 1900s said about this topic of Moshe Feinstein. Next. You should ask the chola if he minds the pain. If he does, stop the treatment, possibly even pray for his death. Next. It says here, when asked the question pretty much directly, and if he wants it or if he doesn't want it. Next. Here he clearly says, let's look down below, and he's talking about the Gemara about Rebbe and the handmaid who davened for his death. She'ikal lefamin sitzarich lispal lo adam kishmitztar ve'ein molin mine refuas l'refoso. V'atfil she'israpel on his kablu sitzarich lispal alav she'amus. You have to pray for him to die. Ki yamsi the Rebbe haisa chachma b'dinei Torah. And by the way, don't ask that, oh, this is the handmaid of Rebbe, what does she know? She was a pretty intelligent lady. I'm sure she was very learned. Next. Rav Moshe Feinstein would hold that you cannot do an action to prolong the life of suffering when asked about heart transplants in the early on of heart transplantation. Next. He says, in order it seems to me that just to keep this person alive, remember the donor would have to be kept alive artificially. If you're going to extend his life of suffering, it's clearly prohibited. I would like to contrast this with the Gemara that we saw, not contrast it, but reiterate it. Rav Moshe didn't bring this down, but the Gemara of the wasp, where the man eats the wasp and is going to surely die. You're allowed to feed him vinegar to keep him alive. Remember, you're only allowed to keep him alive if it's to improve his quality of life. Remember, he's mafkid levese. That was how Rav Belsky understood that Gemara. But just to prolong somebody's life artificially, especially for your own purposes, clearly prolonged life of suffering, it would be usher according to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Next slide. And he says elsewhere here, Aval lasos ma'isa lahari chayav b'yisur nami aser v'keven she'aser lasos ze b'shvil chayatzmo kol sheken she'aser lasos ze b'shvil chayechem. He says in another place as well. Next slide. It's a little bit of a typo here. Even though you can withhold care, you may have to continue antibiotics, foods, and nutrition nonetheless. Here he clearly says, Pashut tzarich la'achilo dvarim she'ein mezikin ve'ein mekalkalin devada machzikin kochem at av she'achol le'ba'atzma ein margish av omdin v'masham she'noso ein margish. It says you have to continue things that are davar tivi. It makes sense that the person needs food to continue living. Of course, if the food is going to be mazik him or harm him, then you could hold back on it. Next slide. Rav Zalman Goldberg, next, he contrasts the Gemara of the debris falling down, that clearly you have to desecrate the Shabbos to let somebody live a few extra moments, to the halacha that we know of Mitter Lahasir Hamaniya Miyatzias Nefesh, that the Ramah says you're allowed to remove that which is holding back death. So do we want a person to live extra time or not? And he says, the Chei Nira next, Shedin Hatzala lo ne'amar ela b'makom shenisna hanitzel shenehen hanitzel b'harachas yamav v'tov lo she'arichu yamav. The concept of being saved is only applicable if somebody wants to be saved. There has to be, in that case, you're allowed to be mechal Shabbos. But if he's suffering so much, and if he does no das, that's not considered Hatzalah. It's pretty dramatic statement. Next. Pain or mental suffering would preclude the obligation to save. Next. He says, it would preclude the obligation to save. Next. And you can certainly withhold, but it doesn't say withdrawal of care in this paragraph that I saw here. Next. Chacham Ovadia Hodaya, a Sephardi resource. Next. Lived in the 1900s. Wrote a sefer called Yaskel Avdi. Said you should not extend suffering. The question is often raised, do you treat with insulin to hold back the dying process, perhaps if he has high sugars? And the answer is, L'or kol ha'amur lefi anias daito ein makom lahatir latet lo hazeriko shel ha'insulin le'akev yetziat hanefesh t'shei ve'al ta'isa adif shelo ligram la'achol tsar al tsaro biyadayim. So he says there's no heter, there's no permissibility to give insulin in such a case to hold back the dying process. It's better just to sit back and let nature take its course, because you don't want to be causing extra pain and suffering. It doesn't clearly say anything about withdrawing care, but shave al tasa. Next. So what does the Rav Shmuel Wozner, the author of the Shevet HaLevi, hold? Next, it seems that he, contrasts the concept of the Ramah where you're allowed to hasten death. Remember, you're allowed to Meisir Hamonea, to remove that which is holding back the dying process. And this seems to conflict against the Gemara of the debris, the law of desecrating the Shabbos to extend the fleeting life of a person who's so injured, the goses. It's a big controversy. To reconcile this, he says next, that the Shabbos case is when there's no overt suffering. The Ramah is talking about a case where there's suffering. So in the Shabbos case, there's no overt suffering somehow. You're allowed to extend the life even for a few moments. The Ramah, of course, is talking about a suffering case. And in that case, you're allowed to Meisir Hamonea next. And he ends off by saying you should not touch a goses if it's going to add pain or suffering. He says, Mikol makom kol zedavke im lo nigram lo yedei zeh ribo yisurei misa v'kavim misrabim v'hochim di'imroim sha'al yedei haracha zeh zu b'sha'os yisurei misaso misrabim zeh v'adai lo tzivsa Torah ki hagafna b'goses u'mitzvah limnoa mimenu zeh b'lilin gobo. It's better, it's a mitzvah to abstain from touching the goses and, just don't contribute to his pain and suffering. Next slide. You can withhold, but no withdrawal is mentioned. Next. So what does the Rabbinical Council of America say? Next. They have a website, and you can download the halachic guidelines to assist the patients and their families in making end-of-life medical decisions. It was published in August 10th, 2009. It goes over what are advanced directives, what is a DNR, is it ever permitted next, and they go over nutrition. But let's look at what is a DNR order, is it ever permitted next? Essentially they say Jewish law emphatically emphasizes the preservation of life, though there may be circumstances when a DNR order would be halachically appropriate. Next. It is essential that the family clarifies their specific intentions and all limitations of the DNR order. Next. What is a do not intubate order? Next. As with the DNR order, there may be circumstances when it is halachically appropriate to withhold intubation. Next. Oxygen is usually considered basic care and should be provided to all patients for whom it is medically indicated. Next. Once a patient has been placed on life support, can it ever be removed? This is a very difficult question. And look below in the bold. This area requires the input of medical and halachic expertise, and what should proceed with great caution. It is worth noting that when you can't remove the respirator, which will directly result in the person's immediate death, because that is forbidden to do an act that directly results in the death of a patient. Next. Regarding nutrition, must artificial nutrition always be provided? And the RCA accepts the opinions of Rav Moshe Feinstein, of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Nutrition is essential, generally recommended to its provision to all patients, whether conscious or comatose. May be circumstances when artificial nutrition may be discontinued in accordance with halacha. Next. So I'd like to end this talk with a reiteration of that amazing story of Rav Hanani ben Trajon, which ironically is in Avodah Zarah Yud Chet. Yud Chet is Chai, 18, which is life, and it talks about his tragic death, but it speaks volumes about life and commitment and sacrifice. So the story goes that Reb Hanani ben Trajon was teaching Torah in public. He was wrapped up in a Torah scroll by the Roman authorities, and they the executioner put wet wool around his body to slow the death process so that he would suffer. Next, and his students said, next, Rebbe, please open your mouth so that you can hasten your own death. By opening your mouth, you will succumb to death faster. And it says, Mutav shi'atlena mishenas naval yichabel hu ba'atzmo. Rabbi Hananiah said, no, it's better that he who gives life should taketh life, and a person shouldn't do it by himself. Next, Amar lo kalstaniri, the executioner said, "Hey, Rebbe, if I do this and I take away, if I increase the flame and I take away the wet wool, are you going to allow me to go to the next world with you next?" He said, "Sure. Why don't you do it, and I'll let you come to the next world with me next." It says that he jumped into he took off the wool. Reb Hanania died, and then the executioner jumped into the flames, and it says that they both went to the next world. So now let's analyze a little bit this story. Next slide. So let's analyze the statement of Reb Hanania ben Trajo next. He said, "Better it is that he that giveth life shall take it away, and you shouldn't kill yourself." Next, so version number 1 is the most commonly accepted explanation. Better it is that he, God, that giveth shall taketh away, and he, human, me, meaning Reb Hanania ben Trajo, should not destroy thyself. And maybe what are the executioners? He saw that, he's such a pious man, so he said, how can I help this pious person out? The lesson is you cannot actively hasten your own death even when suffering. And that is a key lesson, and that's definitely, we saw a lot of the shitos and a lot of the halachic authorities showing that the primacy of life, we have to, every minute counts, every second counts. Next slide. However, there's another version, perhaps, when Reb Hanania ben Trajan was saying, what really impressed the executioner was the fact, perhaps, that he was concerned with the executioner. Next, he was saying, better it is that he, the executioner, that gave that wet wool, shall taketh away the suffering, and he, executioner, should not destroy himself. In other words, he was concerned that you really cannot actively cause someone else to suffer. And he was saying, in his pain and suffering, he was such a pious man. He was saying that you cannot actively cause someone else to suffer. And that was the lesson that the executioner understood. And the executioner threw himself in the fire, not only because he saw the piety of Reb Hanania and that he could withstand the suffering and even be concerned about his own executioner's fate, but because he simultaneously realized the lesson of Reb Hanania, which was a prohibition of prolonging the suffering of others. And that is the concept of today's talk. And on one hand, we have to be mindful of every second, that every second counts, but on the other hand, we also have to be mindful of prolonging unnecessary suffering of people. Thank you very much for listening. Ari Cement. So I'd like to end with the following Dvar Torah, and I heard this in the name of I heard this from Mr. Blech in the name of somebody else that I do not remember. When God sent Hagar out, when Avraham sent Hagar out to the desert with her child Yishmael, he was suffering. He was crying because he was thirsty. She could not withstand watching this, and she was crying, although she was not as thirsty. She stood some distance away, and the lad was sick. Yishmael became sick, and it says that God told Hagar, "Don't worry, because I hear the kol hanar, the cries of the son, ba'asher hu sham, where he is." There are two questions. First of all, how come God listened to the cries of the na'ar? How come God said, "I hear the cries of the lad," and not Hagar's cries? But also, it's a weird terminology to say ba'asher hu sham, in where he is. That's not the Hebrew word for the place. This is not the Hebrew terminology, ba'asher hu sham. And the answer given classically, ba'asher hu sham, is one by Rashi, that Yishmael was in a place now spiritually that was okay, and later on he would sin. So God's saying that to Hagar, that I'm listening to Yishmael ba'asher hu sham, in the place where he is now, I'm going to judge him. And that's really what Hashem was telling Hagar. Another interpretation, however, is beautiful. It says that, why did God listen to Yishmael and not Hagar? Because God was staying by Yishmael's side, because he was the one that was really sick, and God listens and attends very closely to those that are ill. And the point of this Dvar Torah is really to show that taking care of such ill people on the verge of death and who are suffering is really holy work, and is actually, it's very important to remember that we are really in the presence